Going buildless. The year is 2005. You're blasting a pirated MP3 of Feel Good Inc. and chugging vanilla Coke while updating your website. I was doing almost all those things back then. Probably a little after 2005. It's just a simple change. So you log on via FTP, edit your style.css file, hit save, and reload the page to see your changes live. Did that story resonate with you? Well, congrats. A, you're a nerd, and B, you're old enough to remember a time before bundlers, pipelines, and build processes. This was before I was a programmer, essentially. I was just kind of like messing around with computers and trying to get websites to work. I did have a few websites I tried to help maintain, and this was what we did. We just uploaded with FileZilla and FTP right into the host, Bluehost. That was one of the hosting providers. A lot of ISPs actually offered hosting back then too, and I remember we logged into a couple of them as well. Now listen, I really don't want to go back to doing live updates in production. That can get painful real fast. But I think it's amazing when the files you see in your code editor are exactly the same as the files you deliver in the browser. No compilation, no node process, no build step, just edit, save, boom. I agree. With this generally. I think that this is probably a really good thing. I do think that minification can be a good thing as well, but I also think, especially in dev and the development environments, like having the same file that you deploy be the same one you edit is a big thing. That said, I really like TypeScript and type safety. So JSDoc looks really interesting to me. I've liked the little I've done with JSDoc, but adding those comments adds a lot of code that's going to be shipped to the browser. So it really is hard. It's like, I want to use this thing, but this is probably the better thing to use. But at the same time, does it really matter? Will those code comments really make a huge difference? I don't know. I'm not sure. There's something really satisfying about a buildless workflow. Brad Frost recently wrote about raw dogging websites while developing the very groovy site for Frostapalooza. So how far are we away from actually working without builds in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? The idea of buildless development isn't new, but there have been more recent improvements that might get us closer. Let's jump in. The obvious trade-off for a buildless workflow is performance. We use bundlers mostly to concatenate files for few network requests and to avoid long dependency chains that cause loading waterfalls. I think it's still worth considering, but take everything here with a grain of performance salt. I think there's also another advantage to being able to cache things a lot easier when they're in smaller chunks and you load exactly the pieces you need on that web page, and you can cache the pieces that don't change and you can hold on to the ones that or change the ones that do. I think the caching benefits there are pretty significant. So I think it's a big trade-off. HTML. The main reason for build process in HTML is composition. We don't want to repeat the markup for things like headers, footers, etc. for every single page, so we need to keep some of these in separate files and stitch them together later. Oddly enough, HTML is the one where native imports are still an unsolved problem. If you want to include a chunk of HTML in another template, your options are limited. PHP or some other preprocessor language. Server-side includes frames. Like I use Golang templates to concatenate together components into templates to render them out, essentially. You need something like that, like whether it's C# or JavaScript, using something like handlebars or EJS or something like that. You need something to template out the HTML. There's no real standardized way to do this in just HTML, but Scott Gell came up with this idea of using iframes and the onload event to essentially achieve HTML imports. I don't know about this. I don't know if this is a good idea. This stop before this content, children 0. This dot remove. So basically this is a swap. This is similar to what HTMX does, which if you haven't checked out HTMX, you should definitely check out HTMX to do some of this stuff. Especially on an event. It does all this sort of thing. Andy Bell then repackaged that technique into a neat web component. Oh. To load the embedded XVG, this page includes the following markup. Okay, so yeah, we've got this. So this guy, inline embedded SVG, was loaded into an external file. It loaded pretty quick too, for the most part. I do wonder if loading and like layout shift and all that is an issue with this. So that's my main skepticism doing something like this. For my own buildless experiment, I build a simplified version that replaces itself with fetch content. It can be used like this: HTML include source my local file HTML include. This is really close to like what HTMX does, almost. It's pretty close. That comes pretty close to an actual native HTML imports, or even though it now has a JavaScript dependency. Server-side enhancement. Right, so using web components works, but what if we want to nest elements, fetch a piece of content that in itself contains an HTML include? You can run into a waterfall situation again, and you might see things like layout shift when it loads. This is what your server-side framework will help mitigate. I'm hosting my experiment on Cloudflare's pages, and they offer the ability to write a worker script, very similar to a service worker, to interact with the platform. They're going to use the server-side rendering to render these HTML includes. Interesting. And then stream them to the client. That's interesting as an idea. It's possible to use an HTML rewriter, such as in such a worker, to intercept requests to the CDN and rewrite the response. So I can check if the request is for a piece of HTML, and if so, look for the HTML include element in there. Okay, and then you essentially rewrite new included element handler. You can then define a custom handler for each HTML include element it encounters. I made one that pretty much does the same thing as the web component, but server side. It fetches the content defined in the source attribute and replaces the element with it. I would be interested to see what this looks like in like a Node.js framework or even like Go, though, too. You can do this in whatever, like Cloudflare Workers is probably an interesting place to do it, but it's not probably the only place, nor probably the most performant. So it is interesting. It might be interesting to do that somewhere else, maybe. This is a common concept known as edge side includes, ESI, used to inject dynamic pieces of dynamic content into an otherwise static or cached response. By using it here, I can get the best of both worlds, a buildless setup in development with no layout shift in production. That's the big thing. Like, avoiding the layout shift, I think, is probably the biggest thing. Cloudflare workers run at the edge, not the client, but your site isn't hosted there. It should also be possible to use this approach in a regular service worker. When installed, the service worker could rewrite responses to stitch HTML imports into the content. Maybe you could even cache pieces of HTML locally once they've been fetched. I don't know enough about service worker architecture to do this, but maybe someone else wants to give it a shot. Okay, so that's HTML. CSS. Historically, we've used CSS preprocessors or build pipelines to do a few things the language couldn't do: variables, selector nesting, vendor prefixing, and bundling. Well, good news, we now have a native support for variables and nesting, and prefixing is not really necessary anymore in evergreen browsers, except for a few properties. That leaves us with bundling again. CSS has import support for a long time. It's trivial to include style sheets from in other style sheets. It's just really frowned upon. It guarantees that you have a waterfall effect when you do such a thing. Why? Damn performance waterfalls again. Nested levels of import statements in a render blocking style sheet give web developers creeps, and for good reason. What if we had a flat file structure? If you had just one level of imports, wouldn't HTTP2 multiplexing take care of that? Loading all these files in parallel? Chris, not everything runs on HTTP2. That's the problem. Most of the web's still running on HTTP1. Chris Ferdinandi ran some benchmark tests on precisely that, and the numbers don't look so bad. So maybe we could link up a main style sheet that contains the top level imports of smaller files split by concern. We could even use that approach to automatically assign cascade layers to them, like so. All right, so you have the import layer, default, layout, components, utils, theme. Interesting. Design tokens. Love your atomic styles. Instead of Tailwind, you can use something like Open Props to include a set of ready-made design tokens without a build step. They'll be available in all other files as CSS variables. You can do that same thing with Tailwind too, I think. You don't need to build. It's just better to build with Tailwind. How do Open Props avoid that issue? You can pick and choose what you need. Or use all of them at once. Oh, and then you just import what you need. Okay. That's probably a good idea. I wish I could do that with like Tailwind. That would be cool. JavaScript is one where a build step usually does the most work, like transpiling, type checking, compiling JSS, minification, building again. The build workflow can never replace all of that, but it may not have to. Transpiling, for example, is not necessary anymore in modern browsers. Yep, most browsers, IE is dead. You don't have to compile the IE anymore. Don't do it. It's not a thing. Don't support IE anymore. As for building, ES modules come with built-in composition systems, so any browser that understands module syntax, i.e., in example this, allows you to import other modules and even lazy load them dynamically. Yep, you can use the import keyword. The newest addition to the module system are import maps, which essentially allow you to define a JSON schema that maps dependency names into a source location. That location can be an internal path or an external CDN like unpkg. Yeah, this is pretty cool. This is pretty useful. It's like a global place to define your exact version of everything, so you don't have to worry about like it's an alias essentially. It's like it's like your package JSON for the web. So I think it's pretty cool. Any JavaScript on the page can then access these dependencies as if they were bundled with it using the standard syntax. Import render from Preact. So can we ditch all our build tools soon? Probably not. I'd say for production grade development, we're not there quite yet. Performance trade-offs are a big part of it, but there are other small parts or other small problems that you'd likely run into pretty soon once you hit a certain level of complexity. For smaller sites or side projects, though, I can imagine going through the Buildless route just to see how far I can take it. Funnily enough, many build tools advertise their superior DX. For my money, there's no better DX than shipping code straight to the browser and not having to worry about some cryptic node modules error in between. I'd love to see a future where we get that simplicity back. So I think going buildless, I think this is a good thing. I think this simplifies software stacks. I think it's a really good thing to get rid of your build steps. I don't think that it's good to have all sorts of these build steps. You're compiling an interpreted language. It's kind of crazy if you think about it. Like, you shouldn't need to do that. And some of this comes down to JavaScript design decisions. But I really think that ultimately the future is probably type safe with types as comments, TSC to check the errors at edit time, really, and module imports to import things dynamically on the web. And that's that. I think that's the future we really want. I think that's the future we need. So hopefully we'll get to that. But if you like this article, please leave a comment in the video or like the video. We record these every Monday over on Twitch at 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So if you'd like to be here and comment on it, you can join us over there. So, all right. Everybody have a good one.